A cougar appears in the mountains. Why it is crying will bring tears to your eyes. The wind howled through the jagged peaks of the mountain range, sharp and unforgiving, cutting through the trees like a blade. A soft blanket of snow covered the world below, and the sky was a dark, bruised purple as evening descended. The air was frigid, biting, and the world felt impossibly still, too still for a place so wild. But then in the silence, a cry echoed from the crags above, a sound so raw, so sorrowful, that it seemed to ripple through the very fabric of the mountain. The cry wasn't human. It wasn't even a wolf's howl or an eagle's call. It was something deeper, something primal. A cougar in the midst of the highlands, grieving. At the foot of the mountain stood a small cabin, nestled between the towering trees like an outpost from another time. A warm light flickered from the window, casting long shadows over the snow. Inside, Clara Hamilton sat by the fire, her hands clasped tightly around a mug of tea, staring into the flames. Clara had lived here for years, far away from the bustling world below. The mountains were her sanctuary, and yet, tonight, the silence felt more oppressive than usual. She had heard the cry too, the sorrowful wail that echoed through the frozen air, and it pierced her heart with an unfamiliar ache. She stood up, her boots crunching on the wooden floor, her breath visible in the cold air as she pulled on her coat and stepped outside. The snow crunched beneath her feet, the world muffled in its frozen stillness. But the cry rang out again, louder this time, a sound that seemed to tremble the very ground beneath her. Without thinking, Clara grabbed a flashlight from the cabin's porch and began her ascent up the mountain. The jagged cliffs loomed ahead, and the thick trees that lined the base of the mountain seemed to close in around her as she trudged upward, determined to find the source of the cry. The air grew thinner as she climbed, her breath quickening, but the pull of the sound was undeniable. It was as if the mountain itself was calling to her, begging her to understand. She had no idea what she would find, but she knew she couldn't ignore it. Not tonight. Clara's life was quiet. It was a life she had chosen, one away from the bustle of society, away from the noise and chaos of the world that seemed to move so quickly. The small cabin had been a dream of hers ever since she was a little girl, raised in the heart of a city that felt too big, too cold. The mountains, however, had always felt like home. She had found peace here in the isolation. The nearby town was small, with only a handful of people who understood the wildness of the place. They didn't bother her, and she didn't bother them. Clara made a living as a photographer, capturing the beauty of the natural world. Her days were spent exploring the trails, her camera never far from her side, always in search of the perfect shot, a way to capture the mountains she loved so dearly. But even in a place that seemed so far removed from the rest of the world, Clara wasn't immune to the pressures of the outside world. There were days when the isolation pressed too heavily on her chest, when the silence was deafening and the weight of her loneliness seemed unbearable. Her thoughts often wandered to the city, to a life she had left behind. There were friends there, people she had loved, people she had lost touch with over the years. She had chosen this life, but sometimes she questioned whether it had been the right choice. She had traded companionship for solitude, a decision that now seemed harder to justify when the wind howled outside her cabin. Still, there were moments when the mountains spoke to her in a way that nothing else could. The sight of a doe grazing near the edge of the forest, the sound of the river rushing over stones, the way the trees swayed in the breeze. All of these things grounded her in a way no human connection could. But tonight, as she sat by the fire, Clara felt a strange unease creeping into her thoughts. The cry of the cougar had shattered the usual calm, and it was as if something in the world had shifted. Clara had been climbing for hours, her breath coming in sharp bursts, but she felt a growing urgency. The snow, thick and heavy, had begun to fall more heavily, cloaking the mountain in a ghostly white. The trail was growing harder to follow, and yet the cry of the cougar seemed to call her forward, louder with each step. She reached a clearing, and the forest gave way to a rocky outcrop. The wind howled louder here, and the sound of the cougar's cry was unmistakable. It was close now, too close. Clara's flashlight cut through the dark, revealing nothing but stone and snow. The animal's cry grew weaker, more pitiful, as though it was struggling, unable to fight on. She crept closer, her heart pounding in her chest. The cliffs ahead were steep, and the last rays of sunlight had already disappeared behind the horizon, leaving her in the blackness of the night. But Clara pressed on. The cougar's cry came again, but this time it was followed by a soft, strangled growl. Clara froze, her hand gripping the flashlight tighter. She was on the edge of the outcrop now, looking down at a small, snow-covered ledge below. And then she saw it. A cougar, its fur matted with blood and snow, was lying on the ledge, its body heaving with each painful breath. Its eyes were wide with fear and pain, but there was something else in them, something desperate. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had seen mountain lions before, had photographed them from a safe distance, but this was different. The cougar was injured, its side torn open as though it had been caught in a vicious fight. It was struggling to move, but each attempt caused it to emit that same heart-wrenching cry. Clara's instincts kicked in. She couldn't just leave it there. Her mind raced. Should she try to help? But what could she do? She had no medical training, no tools with her. But the animal needed help. Clara couldn't ignore it. She couldn't let it suffer. But as she took a step forward, something else caught her eye. Movement in the snow. A figure emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden behind a hood and a thick scarf. His eyes locked with Clara's, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Stay back," the man warned, his voice rough, the wind carrying it away almost as soon as he spoke. Clara felt a mix of surprise and frustration. Who was this man, and why was he here? But the man didn't wait for a response. He moved quickly to the cougar, crouching beside it and gently touching the animal's side. Clara could see the tenderness in his movements, as though he had done this before. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaking. He glanced at her, his expression hard to read. "I'm trying to help," he said quietly, though his tone was cold, almost detached. "You should go. This is no place for a woman alone." Clara bristled at his dismissal, but she couldn't argue. He was already doing what she couldn't. She watched him carefully, seeing the way he moved with practiced ease. The man knew this mountain, and he knew the animals that lived on it. She had to admit there was something comforting in that. But her gut told her that there was more to this encounter than a simple rescue. The man's name was Gabe. He was a ranger, but not one you'd find working in a national park or patrolling for tourists. Gabe had lived on the mountain for years, a solitary figure who seemed to belong more to the wilderness than the world below. He had heard the cougar's cry earlier that evening, the same as Clara had, but unlike her, he had known exactly where to go. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. His focus was solely on the cougar, assessing its wounds, his hands moving with practiced precision. Clara couldn't look away from him, even as she wanted to. She didn't trust him, not fully, not yet. But there was something about the way he handled the animal that made her pause. He wasn't just a stranger to the wild. He was a part of it, as natural as the trees that grew in the shadows of the mountain. And in that moment, Clara realized that she was out of her depth. "I've been tracking this cougar for days," Gabe finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "She's been wounded for a while. Someone or something attacked her. I wasn't sure if I'd make it in time." Clara felt a pang of guilt. She had been climbing for hours, distracted by the mystery of the cry, while Gabe had been on the trail trying to save this creature. "Why didn't you call for help?" Clara asked, though the question felt hollow. She wasn't sure why it bothered her so much, but it did. Gabe shook his head, his eyes briefly meeting hers. "I work alone. Always have." And there it was, that cold, detached edge in his voice. He wasn't looking for company, and he wasn't interested in explaining himself. The cougar, though still breathing, had begun to weaken. Gabe's eyes flickered to Clara, and for the first time he seemed to truly see her. "Help me move her," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Clara hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should. But the cougar's cry echoed in the air again, and Clara felt something stir inside her. This wasn't just about survival, it was about compassion. She stepped forward, her hands trembling as she knelt beside the cougar. The animal's eyes met hers briefly, filled with a quiet desperation that made her heart ache. The journey back down the mountain was treacherous. Snow fell heavily, blanketing the world in a thick layer of white that made every step feel like an obstacle. The cougar, despite Gabe's best efforts, was weakening quickly. Every few steps he would pause, adjusting the animal in his arms, trying to shield it from the biting wind. Clara helped when she could, holding the flashlight, guiding him through the increasingly treacherous terrain. Her mind raced with thoughts of what might happen. Would they make it back? Would the cougar survive? And more than that, what was it that drew her to this man, to this mountain, to this animal in distress? The further they descended, the more desperate the situation became. The mountain was unforgiving, and their path was slowly being covered by fresh snowfall. With every step, Clara could feel the tension mounting. But even in the midst of danger, there was a strange, unspoken bond forming between her and Gabe. She learned that Gabe had come to the mountains after losing his own family years before, a painful wound he had never fully healed from. It was the mountains that had kept him grounded, just as they kept Clara grounded in her solitude. But tonight, as they moved together down the snowy path, they were no longer strangers. The cougar had become the thread that connected them, and Clara realized that they were both running from something in their past, seeking solace in a world that felt too large and too unforgiving. But even as the storm grew stronger and the shadows of the mountain pressed in on them, there was a flicker of hope. Together, they would make it through. The tension between Gabe and Clara grew, but so did their understanding. Gabe, with his stoic demeanor, began to open up slowly. It wasn't easy, but the shared mission brought them closer than either of them expected. And through their conversations, Clara learned more about the man she had once thought of as a mysterious stranger. But, as the cougar's condition worsened, the stakes were raised even higher. Would they make it to safety in time? Would their growing trust be enough to save the cougar and themselves from the unforgiving wilderness? The storm reached its peak, and the mountain seemed to fight back with fury. With no path to follow, Gabe and Clara were forced to make an emergency decision. The cougar was fading fast, but it was Clara who made the choice to press on despite the odds. As the storm finally began to clear, Clara and Gabe stood side by side, watching the sunrise over the peaks. The cougar had survived, and so had they, in Cell. The quiet aftermath, the two of them found a new understanding, not just of each other, but of the land they both loved, and the deep connection between them that had been forged through the storm. As Clara looked out across the mountains, she realized that sometimes the bonds we share aren't just between humans. They stretch across species, across time, across pain and hope, and for the first time in a long while she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be.